So we recently went from being a family of three to a family of four. And everybody told us, watch out, because when you become a family of four, it might be a little hard on your other child. So we have an 18-month-old daughter named Cora. And so Victoria and I were watching, really carefully to see, how is she going to be reacting with, this little sibling that's coming home. And about 2 weeks after we brought Grant home from the hospital, I'm sitting on the couch, and I'm watching the kids. Grant is in his little swing, and Cora's playing with some toys, when all of a sudden Grant starts to cry. And I'm kind of waiting on the couch to see, all right, how's Cora going to react to this? And so she's playing with her toys, and she hears Grant cry, and she stops, and she turns around, and she, walks over, and she's, staring at him. And I'm like, what's going to happen now? She's staring, and she bends over, and she gives him a kiss. Oh, yes, very sweet. It didn't last. So he keeps crying, surprise. It didn't work. And so she's standing there, he's crying, and she lifts up her arm, and she starts hitting him. And I jump off the couch, I'm like, oh no. I grab her, I said, oh no, Cora, we don't hit. That's big ouchie. And I see her looking at me with her big eyes, and they start getting all watery. And she goes, no hit, no hit. And I go, that's right. I give her a hug, tell her that I love her. And I just think to myself, man, I am such a good dad. This is pretty easy. I don't know. A couple days later, we're sitting on the couch. Our whole family's there. So Victoria and Cora and Grant. And Victoria is feeding Grant when he starts to cry. He starts to get a little fussy. So she puts him over his shoulder, starts patting him to help him burp. Cora stands up, sees what's going on, lifts up her hand, and starts hitting his back. Then she stops, looks at me, and says, no hit. My stomach dropped. And I felt like such a terrible father. I thought she was trying to hurt him. She was trying to help him. Misunderstandings, miscommunications, differences in opinions and personalities. There are lots of different things that can cause us to have conflict with people, that can cause us to have conflict in our relationships. Christmas is coming up, and I know that there's some of you that, you just barely survived Thanksgiving. Maybe it was a little tense with your family, your friends, and, now the thought of seeing all of them again a couple weeks later, you're like, how am I going to do it? And the thing is I'm willing to bet that probably most of you know what your tendencies are. You probably know, how you are most likely to get into conflict with somebody. I think it boils down to two main branches. Either you are an explosive person, so when you're in conflict with somebody, you're loud and aggressive, maybe you cry and it's dramatic, or maybe you're a little bit quieter and your conflict's a little bit more bitter, a little bit more passive-aggressive, a little bit more awkward. And regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, I'm also willing to bet that you probably know what you need to do to not do that, right? If you're an explosive person, don't be so explosive. Don't be so explosive. Maybe a little bit more gentle, a little bit more patient. And if you're more of a quiet conflict person, you need to speak up and be a little bit more honest and forgiving. And it doesn't help, does it? We know where we tend to fall. We know what we need to do. And probably most of us don't enjoy being in conflict with the people closest to us and hurting our relationships, and yet still we do. And that can feel kind of hopeless. That can be kind of discouraging because it's we don't want to be hurting the relationships that we have with people. So what do we do? Here at Fireside Church, we're really passionate about looking at God's wisdom, learning what we need to do, applying that to our life so that we can live a life that's more like Jesus lived. But that's not the entire picture of the story, because sometimes we need to know what to do. We need to look at God's word, see what it tells us to do, and then do that thing in our life. But we are a little different than a self-help program. Christianity is not a self-help program because we believe that our help doesn't come from ourselves. We can't just decide to stop. We need help from outside of ourselves. The Christian journey is this wonderful mix of this external truth about God that the Spirit uses inside of us to create transformation that everybody can see. It's this external and internal. And so sometimes we need to know what to do, but sometimes we need to focus more on what we need to know. Sometimes it's not so much about doing, it's more about knowing. Because the reality is that our conflicts that we have, this lack of peace in our relationships, it's caused by a spiritual battle that's happening. So if we're going into a spiritual battle, we need help from our spiritual king. And so today we're gonna slow down and we're just going to spend some time on what we need to know. And what we need to know about God today is that we need to know that God is compassionate and gracious. That God is compassionate and gracious. Now, if we want to know what God says about himself, the best place to look is to see, well, what does God say about himself? So we're going to be in the book of Exodus, chapter 34, verse 6. We're going to put it on the screen in just a second. Only one verse today. And in fact, we're going to zoom in even tighter than that. But let me tell you, this is one of the most important verses in the entire Old Testament. It's where God says what he is like. In fact, this passage in Scripture is referenced more than 20 times directly and way more than that indirectly. It's a critical passage that shows us what God is like. Exodus is the book of the Bible in the Old Testament where God rescues his people, the Israelites, from slavery to Egypt. It's that famous book with the plagues. He splits the sea, people walk through it. Moses goes up the mountain, gets the 10 Commandments, comes back down the mountain, and people, the Israelite people, have already turned their back on God. And they've decided to worship a cow statue instead. Where we are in chapter 34 is that Moses has petitioned God to give them another shot. So God has brought them back up the mountain, and he's renewing this relationship that he has with his people. He's renewing the vows, and that's where you jump in verse 6. It says, and this is God, God passed in front of Moses, and God said, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Now, I don't have time to go through all 5 of those characteristics today, but we're going to zoom in on the first 2. We're zooming in on compassionate and gracious. Now, when God refers to himself as compassionate and gracious, and when other people refer to him that way, those 2 words almost always go together. Compassionate and gracious. And in the original Hebrew, they rhyme. So it's like this rhyming phrase, compassionate and gracious, they rhyme. It's talking about God, and that's how he describes himself. So there's like a package deal that works together to give us a picture of who God is. So it's really important that we understand what those words mean. The word compassionate means to withhold judgment. It's very similar to the word mercy, but there's something bigger happening. Because the word in Hebrew that is compassionate is very, very similar to the Hebrew word womb, a place inside of a woman where her baby grows. So what God is saying is that his heart for his people, his compassion for his people, is like a mom's heart for her child. That his heart for his people is like a mother's heart for her baby. And the word gracious is to give us the feeling of excitement that we have when we give someone an awesome gift. Christmas is coming up. You know that feeling that you get when you know you got somebody like just what they want? They're gonna love it. That's the feeling of graciousness, but the gift that God is specifically talking about here is the gift of rescue. So God is describing both how he feels and how he acts towards his people. His heart is compassionate and he is gracious with them because he wants to rescue them. That's what he did with the Israelite people. He heard their cries because they were in slavery in Egypt. His heart had a deep, deep feeling of compassion for his people, and his grace was providing them the means of rescue. His heart for his people is compassionate and gracious. Now, I have never given a mother's love before, shocker, but I have seen it. I saw when my wife, Victoria, when she found out she was pregnant with our son, Grant, she was so happy. But I don't need to tell the moms in the room that pregnancy isn't that fun. It's not that fun. She was sick. She couldn't eat the foods that she wanted. She couldn't exercise like she wanted. She had sleepless nights. She didn't feel good. She was in chronic pain. Our son was using her bladder like a punching bag. Like, it wasn't fun. And then she goes into labor, and that chronic pain becomes a sharp pain. That pain was not fun, and it was an emotional, challenging labor. But when Victoria gave birth to our son and she was holding him, even though her lips were turning blue, her blood pressure dropping, the doctors were scrambling, she looked at her son and she said, "I love you." That's how God feels about you. And that's just day one. I don't need to tell the moms here that pain, that struggle, the love that you have for your child, it doesn't just stop after day one. It's an incredible, incredible love that God has for us. And what's so amazing about this is that God goes on to describe this love in greater detail in Isaiah. This is chapter 49, verse 15. God is speaking. He says, "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child that she has born? No. But though she may forget, I will not forget you." God will not forget his people. Even though a mother might forget her great love, she may forget, and maybe you're here and you're like, "My mom wasn't a great mom. She wasn't in my life." Let me tell you, God says, my love is so much better. He says, "I will not forget you." Do you think about God like that? Is that what comes to your mind when you think about him? When God sees us hurting, he has a heart of deep, deep compassion on us. Like a mother for her baby. A mom is not going to ignore her baby when her baby is in trouble. She's going to help him. She's going to rescue them. God says, "I will not ignore you when you're hurting, and I will give you the means of rescue." What this means is that God sees you when you're hurting. He sees you when you're alone, when you're struggling, when you're hurting. He sees you when you're having tension in your marriage. He sees you when you can't get along with your kids. He sees you when you're struggling to make ends meet. He sees you when you're anxious and depressed and afraid and scared. He sees us. Do you know that God says, "I will not forget you"? There is not a single tear that has ever been shed that God has missed. Not one. We forget. We forget. We overlook. We ignore. We lack compassion. We have misunderstandings. We struggle in our relationships. But God does not. And in fact, Jesus is the ultimate act. This is so important. He is the ultimate act of God's compassion and his graciousness. Because when God became a man, he entered into the suffering of man. That is the act of compassion made manifest among people. We can read about it. When Jesus was here, his heart was moved for us. He wept. He felt sad. He had a deep, deep compassion. But he didn't just leave us there. He also was the means of rescue. Jesus is the compassion of God and the grace of God made manifest. Jesus is the means of rescue. It's not just something for the Israelites back then, because God does not change. It's not just in the New Testament, it's also for us today. That right now, if you're hurting, God has compassion on you, and he has given you the means of rescue. God is compassionate and gracious. You know, I think that there's a temptation here for people who have been a believer a long time. That we think that we just need God's forgiveness and compassion and grace and mercy and all these nice things about God. We just need that to get started. Then we're on our way, walking our walk, living our life, going to work, going to school, doing our thing. It's just the ignition switch in the car. That is not true. The compassion and the grace of God is the fuel that we need, that propels us and drives us and sustains us in our walk, in our life, to be more like Jesus every single day. We need to be filled up, and just like a car cannot fill itself up with gas, we have got to go to the external source. The way that we get fueled up is by knowing that God is compassionate and gracious to us. So if you're feeling burnt out, you're just tired, discouraged, if you're lacking compassion and grace for other people, maybe you just need to fill up. Maybe you need to be reminded that our only hope is that God is compassionate and gracious to us. You know, it is so easy to bicker with our friends, to belittle our wives, to disrespect our husbands, to not appreciate the people in our life, to run so short-tempered with the people around us. We have got to fill up. Now, I just want to address something here in the room real quick. It's possible that the conflict that you have in a relationship is not due to you lacking compassion and grace. It's possible that it is an unhealthy or an abusive relationship. God is not saying that you need to be in relationship with somebody who hurts you, an abusive person. That's not what compassion and grace means. It's not just being nice. Compassion means that we enter into the suffering of others, and grace means that we give them the means of rescue. That is different than allowing abuse. I also want to say, maybe you're here and you're like, you're not so sure about this God guy, you're a little skeptical. Maybe for you, you've been in and out of church, you've been struggling to take what you hear on Sunday or what you read and apply it to your life. There's a disconnect, you're a little skeptical, you're not sure. Let me say this very clearly. This is what I want to share with you. Just what if God was who he says he was? Like, not what society says or social media, your friends, your teachers, your parents. Like, just what if God actually was compassionate and gracious? Just what if, like, he loved you like a mom loves a little baby? And what if he's given you the means of rescue to help you from what you're suffering from, to rescue you from your sin, from yourself, from the bad and the evil and the horrible things, the pain? I'm here to tell you that he has. And even if you're still skeptical, I mean, couldn't we all admit that? Man, wouldn't that be wonderful if that was true? Like, how awesome would that be? If there was a God who actually loved us and was compassionate and gracious to us, that'd be incredible. You know, I struggle with this. I do. And I am so slow to give compassion and grace to other people. And yet, the few times in my life when I have done that well, it has made a bigger impact than any invitation to church or any debate that I've ever had. You know, when I used to work at a restaurant in Albany called the Cheesecake Factory, and shout out Cheesecake Factory, and I was a waiter there, and there was another waiter there. He's about my age. We'll call him Tim. And now Tim was a very difficult person to love. He was really mean and treated people really bad, and he treated me really bad. Like, when I became a believer, he made fun of me constantly. It was bad. And Tim was the kind of guy that I just avoided. You know, I saw that he was working. I'd go the other way. I didn't want to be near him, didn't want to be around him. And one day I come into work, and I just see him across the restaurant, and, you know, I can just tell that he's having a hard day. You know how you can just tell when someone's having a hard day, just the way they're carrying themselves, it just looked heavy. And I can't tell you why, but by God's grace, I walked up to him, I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, Tim, I'm just really glad you're here. And he looks at me like, what? He says, what are you talking about? I'm a terrible person, and I treat you like trash. Why would you say that to me? And I was like, we all have bad days, but I'm just thankful you're here. I appreciate you for you. And he looks at me, and he starts weeping and gives me a giant hug. And so now I'm in the middle of the restaurant holding this man weeping, and it's like, oh, this is a little weird. But let me tell you, for years after, every single time I saw him and I worked with him, he came running up to me and would give me a hug. He went from being my biggest advocate or biggest antagonist to being my biggest advocate. He defended me and my faith in front of other people. And he would later tell me that no one in his life has ever been happy to see him. The turnaround in our relationship was so incredible that if it was written in a movie, you'd be like, nah, that's not real. And I'm embarrassed to confess to you that even having lived that experience, I am still so slow to give compassion to other people. And I think that we can all, if we have a relationship with Jesus, we've all experienced the compassion and the grace that God has given us, and yet we can still be so slow to give that to other people. The only thing that really helps us is to know how God is compassionate and gracious to us. Fireside Church, we are going into the Christmas season. We are here. Christmas is coming. What if this Christmas, instead of just talking about Jesus, we showed people what Jesus was like? What if this Christmas we use this as an opportunity to show compassion and grace on someone who doesn't usually get it? That's one of the most impactful ways that we will be able to share the hope of Jesus with our communities, with our friends, with our family, and with our coworkers. But we need to know deeply that God is compassionate and gracious to us.